Resuming debate, the honourable member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is my first opportunity to speak in this House since the events of last week. I am proud of how this House conducted itself in the wake of such terror, such atrocity, such shocking tragedy. It was good for Canada that we resumed sitting the very next morning, Mr. Speaker. Good for Canada that we stood strong. Good for Canada, good for our Canada that our leaders addressed Canadians and that our leaders embraced. Good for the nation, Mr. Speaker, to embrace. It's been 3 years, Mr. Speaker, and last week was the first time as a member of Parliament that I felt partisan lines dissolve, momentarily at least, Mr. Speaker. I felt that somewhat after Jack Layton died and after the passing of Jim Flaherty, but not to the degree that I felt a week ago here today. This House, Mr. Speaker, came together as one. It's not every day I stand up and applaud the Conservative Prime Minister. It's not every day the Prime Minister stands up and applauds the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, the New Democratic Party of Canada, or the third-party Liberals. It's not every day I personally compliment the Prime Minister. In fact, Mr. Speaker, it never happened until last week. The Prime Minister made a statement in this House last Thursday that I've since repeated a number of times because it struck a chord, because I agreed with the statement, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said, quote, that in our system, in our country, we are opponents, but we are never enemies, end quote. Mr. Speaker, we are united in this House by the desire to better our country. As opponents, we disagree on how to get there, but we all strive for a better Canada, for this country to be the best country that it can be. We are opponents, but we are never enemies. That's why, Mr. Speaker, it's so infuriating to see this government introduce, yet again, an absolutely massive anti-democratic omnibus bill, a bill that amounts to an affront to the principles and spirit that this precious institution was built on. The Prime Minister said we are opponents, but we are never enemies. I say, Mr. Speaker, we are Canadians, but we are never fools. We are members of Parliament, but we are never puppets, or we should at least we should never be puppets, Mr. Speaker. We are elected to serve. We are elected to stand on guard for the Canadian way, to stand on guard for democracy, to stand on guard for our communities and our constituents. But omnibus bills such as this are an attack on Parliament. Omnibus bills undermine Parliament, Mr. Speaker. In the words of former Auditor General Sheila Fraser, quote, Parliament has become so undermined it is almost unable to do the job that people expect of it, end quote. Mr. Speaker, this bill, Bill C-43, is a budget bill, but it is so much more than that, Mr. Speaker. It's an omnibus bill, meaning it's a proposed law that covers a number of diverse or unrelated topics. A number, in this case, Mr. Speaker, is a truckload. A number, in this case, Mr. Speaker, could fill a boat to the gunnels. This bill is 400 pages long. This bill has more than 400 clauses. This bill amends dozens of acts. This bill contains a host of measures that weren't even mentioned in the original budget, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is the Conservatives' 6th straight omnibus bill. This is too much for one bill, Mr. Speaker. There are some things in this bill we like ending pay-to-pay billing so that Canadians are not forced to pay for a paper copy of their bill. We like that, Mr. Speaker. Although even that doesn't go far enough. This bill only bans pay-to-pay billing for telecom and broadcast companies. What about banks, Mr. Speaker? Why should banks still be allowed to gouge Canadians? Because that's what they're doing, Mr. Speaker. By charging Canadians for their paper bills, they're gouging Canadians, and the Conservatives are letting them away with that. So there are some things also that we outright disagree with, Mr. Speaker, in this omnibus bill, like denying access to social assistance for refugee claimants. What else do they live on if it's not social assistance in so many cases, Mr. Speaker? This attack on the most vulnerable comes on the heels of conservative cuts to refugee health care, a move that the federal court called, quote, cruel and unusual. Mr. Speaker, denying access to social assistance for refugee claimants was a backbench private member's bill that was rammed into this omnibus bill after the media and anti-poverty and labor groups tore it apart. So, Mr. Speaker, there are parts of this omnibus bill that we like. There are more parts of this omnibus bill that we don't like, and there are more parts of this bill that I won't even get to, Mr. Speaker. It is not possible. In the end, there is no way that a parliamentarian, there's no way that I, as Member of Parliament for St. John's South Mount Pearl, can critique this omnibus bill, let alone analyze details of over 400 clauses, given such limited debate and limited time, and so much stacked, so much rammed into one bill. Now, Mr. Speaker, here's how one parliamentarian described the use of omnibus bills, and I got this today, Mr. Speaker, from a column by Russell Wangurski in today's Telegram, the daily newspaper in East Coast Newfoundland. Here's a quote from a parliamentarian. In the interest of democracy, I ask, how can members represent their constituents on these various areas when they are forced to vote in a block on such legislation and such concerns? I would argue that the subject matter of the bill is so diverse that a single vote on the content would put members in conflict with their own principles. Now, who was the parliamentarian who was so outraged at the liberal blockbuster omnibus bill? Who was that parliamentarian, Mr. Speaker? None other than the Prime Minister of Canada himself when he was in opposition in 1994. Mr. Speaker, when this Conservative government and the Liberal governments before it ram so much legislation in an omnibus bill, it leads, Mr. Speaker, it leads to mistakes. And who pays for those mistakes, Mr. Speaker? Canadians pay for those mistakes, Mr. Speaker. Newfoundlanders and Labradorians pay for those mistakes. Now, the Conservative government used a 2012 omnibus bill to create the new Social Security Tribunal, which hears appeals related to the Canada Pension Plan, disability benefits, and employment insurance, old age security, Mr. Speaker. Officially, my constituency office has been told that the backlog of cases is 1 year, Mr. Speaker. Unofficially, the backlog is 3 years, Mr. Speaker. Now, that 2012 omnibus bill capped the size of the tribunal at 74 full-time staff. It also removed limits on the number of hours part-time staff can work. Thus, Mr. Speaker, the backlog. Now the Conservative government is using this latest budget bill to expand the Social Security Tribunal. This government says the change will allow it to add employees to respond to a backlog of nearly 11,000 cases across the country related to CPP and OAS. 11,000, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that mistake likely would not have happened if that piece of legislation wasn't lost in an omnibus bill, if members of Parliament were given an opportunity to better scrutinize the bill. But we weren't, Mr. Speaker, and Canadians paid the price. Now, the journalist Michael Harris, he's well known in Newfoundland and Labrador for his work with the Sunday Express newspaper and for books such as Unholy Orders and Lament for an Ocean. He's got a new book out, Mr. Speaker. It's called Party of One, Reflections on a Prime Minister. Now, he quotes Peter Milligan, former Speaker of the House of Commons, quote, Parliament can hardly be weakened any more than it already is, bracket, the Prime Minister can't go much further without making the institutional dysfunctional. Now, Michael Harris also quotes Farley Mowat, the late Farley Mowat, who said this Prime Minister is, quote, the most dangerous human being ever elevated to power in Canada. Mr. Speaker, we are opponents. We are never enemies. The Prime Minister is right, Mr. Speaker. We are opponents. We are opponents. Now, this Prime Minister has to stop treating us with contempt. This Prime Minister has to stop treating us like fools. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Palliser.
Mr. Speaker, just a comment rather than a question, Mr. Speaker. I've been listening to the debate this morning, and the opposition keep talking about this mammoth number of pages, 400, I've heard 400, 450. Mr. Speaker, there's only half a page here. it's column print and there's 2 columns on every page, so you can't be counting that as a full page. It's a half a page. So if you got 400 pages, you got about 200. Now, whether you like it or lump it, that's just the way it is, folks. Take a look at the page and you'll see it. Just a comment, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
The Honorable... Order. Order. The Honourable Member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Half a page, half wit. What I'd say to that, Mr. Speaker, is we're talking about 400 clauses. We're talking about amendments to dozens and dozens of acts. We're talking about a host of measures that weren't even mentioned in the original budget, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of clauses, dozens of amendments to dozens of acts. Don't let that Conservative member fool you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Sackville, Eastern Shore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable colleague from the great province of Newfoundland and Labrador for his speech, but I just wanted to let him know the the Standing Committee of Veterans Affairs just did a unanimous report with recommendations for the government in order to improve the new Veterans Charter. Now they just said we have to study it more, which means more delays. Now they bring forward an omnibus bill, Mr. Speaker, which includes everything but the kitchen sink. Unfortunately, I asked the honourable member if he's read through the entire thing, will realize the word veteran is not anywhere in that bill whatsoever. So how can the government cram everything into the legislation and completely ignore our veteran community of Canada?
Absolutely.
The Honourable Member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Mr. Speaker, it's not only veterans that aren't mentioned in this omnibus bill. Housing is not mentioned at all. And housing is a problem from coast to coast to coast, from one end of this country to the other. What I would say about veterans, Mr. Speaker, and I'm glad the critic for Veterans Affairs, and he's such a fantastic critic for Veterans Affairs, he'll be visiting my riding of St. John South Mount Pearl next month, Mr. Speaker. But there's a quote that resonates. There's a quote that resonates with the people of my riding, Mr. Speaker, and the quote is that if you can't look after your veterans, don't send your people to war. If you can't look after your veterans, don't send your people to war. We're not looking after our veterans, Mr. Speaker. This Conservative government is not looking after our veterans, and they're going to war.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The Honourable Member for Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is nominally and allegedly something to do with the budget, but as it's been described by my friend from Newfoundland, that in these 460 pages, dozens of laws changed, hundreds of clauses, so little to do with the economy, and yet the one piece that the government's hanging on to is to take more than $500 million from the EI scheme, which the Conservatives even admit is money that doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to the people who paid into it, the employers and the employees, and that to create, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, 800 jobs. This is the great solution the Conservatives have to a fragile and flat economy that exists in Canada right now. Almost zero private sector jobs created in the last 18 months. And the Conservatives' answer to this is according to Stats Can, by the way. Conservatives can yell not true as much as they want, but the truth is what Canadians are also experiencing, that the private sector is not growing, that their one so-called solution is to rip off the EI fund, more than $500 million to create 800 jobs, which the PBO says costs about $550,000 per job. So I ask my friend, with just a little over a third of Canadians even be able to get employment insurance when they need it, is this a proper use of something like that fund to create 800 jobs at a cost of more than $500,000 per job?
Member for St. John's South Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. The Conservative government has been lauded in the media in some quarters, Mr. Speaker, for what they've done with the economy, for leading us through some turbulent economic times, better than other countries around the world, Mr. Speaker. But the math, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative math is absolutely out of whack, is absolutely out of lunch. As the honourable member just mentioned, Mr. Speaker, $500 million to create that's stolen from the EI fund to create 800 jobs, Mr. Speaker. 500 million for 800 jobs? That is a joke, Mr. Speaker.